Good morning, or whatever time it is for you, I guess. What do you say we go ahead and wrap up May reading? I read 10 books in May, which means I am getting back in the swing of things and looking at or having happened to glance at the thumbnail for my mid-year freakout tag last year as I'm kind of trying to plan for the summer so I don't leave you guys as I did earlier this year for quite as much time there. I realize I'm kind of on the same pace so far this year, so hopefully we avoid any like major slumps, but it feels like I am getting back in the swing of things. There are a lot of really exciting book releases, especially coming the second half of this year, so it's kind of full pedal to the gas, and I think overall I had a pretty successful May. Now, there were some hits and there were indeed some misses, but we will get into all of that here in a moment. First of all, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, have been in fact for 5 years now, which I didn't properly recognize in May. I've mentioned it in some videos, but maybe someday I will kind of sit back and reflect on that. But either way, I would love to have you along for the ride for however many years we continue doing this. So go ahead and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And with that, let's go ahead and get into what I read last month. Putting down the coffee because I will not be able to multitask there. So first of all, we are jumping into an ongoing in that last month I reread All the Feels by Olivia Dade, which I said established itself for me as a comfort read at this point. I read it physically the first time I read it, and I reread it on audio, loved both experiences. And even though I reread the first book in the series, spoiler alert, last year, also reread on audio, and All the Feels this year, I never actually read the third in the series, Shipwrecked, which I did pre-order on Kobo. So spoiler alert, I did finally get around to this book. And this is looking at Maria and Peter, who are co-stars, but kind of peripheral co-stars of our leads in the first two books, because this entire series is kind of a parody in some ways of Game of Thrones. It is following actors in a very popular adaptation of a fantasy series that is based on the Aeneid, and there are run-ins with the kind of awful showrunners, and we'll get into some of that in particular with this book. But this book is kind of the slow burn book, and it is the co-stars book, because both previous books have featured female love interests that are outside of the world of the show, but we still get to see the world of the show and the other actors, especially through like group texts and through our previous male love interests friendship. But here we are following Peter and Maria, who largely within their arc on the show are by themselves. But we don't start with them on the show, which gets into the slow burn of it. We start with them having a one-night stand in a hotel by happenstance. And after this one-night stand, Maria scoot boogies it on out of there, and Peter is pretty butthurt about it, both from his attraction and the connection he felt with Maria the night before, as well as some baggage he has from past relationships. And so when he immediately goes to an audition that is primed to kind of revitalize and refocus and completely change his career, he is flabbergasted to be in the audition room with Maria. And he is also not the most gracious scene partner in that room, because Maria's background as an actor comes from the stage, and the stage in Sweden, not in America. And so after this audition, where she is able to take notes in the rehearsal room very well and recalibrate her performance in a way that honestly, I don't really get the idea that Peter would be able to adjust that easily in the audition room. That being said, it becomes clear that they are the front runners for these roles, and so they have to grapple with the fact that they are going to be very isolated based on the character arcs of these characters together on a remote island filming as these characters despite this one night, which you may be like, oh, that's not that big a deal. One night, he has some feelings, there's some unrequited love there. However, as they're on their way out of this audition room, Peter says some honestly pretty mean things to Maria in relation to the work, not the night, but the impetus, of course, is the night. And so we watch them over the course of the filming of this show, which is multi-seasons, kind of reframe their relationship and form a friendship on set, form a friendship with the crew on set, and just how their characters kind of shift over this course of time. Where I ran into issues was kind of the pacing of it. This was meant to be a slow burn and for us to watch these characters kind of gravitate toward each other and to have always felt this magnetism toward each other and have to grapple with that. But a lot of work has to be done to, especially Peter, because Peter's kind of in his butt. And there's a lot to be said about how these full adults are kind of reframing their careers in context of the show, and that I really appreciated, and that in particular fed in to the third act conflict. It was more about what do we see the future looking like as individuals, as a couple? What do we value in our work, and how does our work interact with our personal life? And the personal life aspect is incredibly important because there are a lot of wounds from both parts of the couple, both Peter and Maria, in terms of their past and what they need emotionally in a relationship and what that looks like and the communication there. So it's really, I did appreciate that that was about, or that conflict was about, what do we see our futures looking like as adults? And is our relationship, even with that attraction and that love there, compatible with the future in that way? I really enjoyed that piece. However, the pacing otherwise, it felt a little lackluster to me because it lost some of that urgency in the kind of spread of it. And I think there was a way to accomplish that slow burn of it without it feeling so kind of disparate, because in effect, I feel like we didn't feel, or I didn't feel like as a reader, there was as much of a slow burn. Additionally, that kind of slow burn and that angstier side of things, while we did have deeper explorations of our characters in the first two books, absolutely, but balancing it with that tone. But I thought the balance of that with the kind of humorous tone was handled really successfully. Here, I didn't feel that as much. There was still even more conflict with the showrunners, which has been kind of permeating. It was much less, I would argue, in the first book. In the second book, we saw that conflict, especially with one of them being Lauren's family. And here we saw it especially in relation to body image for Maria and Peter, because another one of the most successful things for me in this book, and what I was really excited about when diving into this book, is that we have two fat characters at the helm, and to see that body representation for a male love interest as well was really important to me. And I did really enjoy the way that Peter's body was described in this book. I always appreciate some good thigh appreciation, especially, which I felt like we got here for sure. And so in relation to the showrunner's arc of that, though, some of the conflict and what kind of unites them is that a part of the showrunners anticipated, or what they wanted for the arc of these characters, was for them to basically waste away on this island and to lose a drastic amount of weight. And so the showrunners had gotten a lot of positive publicity and was kind of riding on the body representation in the show, and then they wanted to undermine that. And Maria was very much against that. And Peter would have been willing to do it for the job, which kind of shows their differences in terms of how they view the work as well, and some of that conflict. But ultimately, Peter did unite with Maria on this. But we had that conflict with the showrunners, but at the same time, it really felt like we were further kind of parodying these showrunners, and the shtick of it started to get kind of old. Not the kind of roasting of these men for the choices and the position they were putting their actors in, but just the kind of loose parallels to real things, which I can understand and appreciate and did in the first two books, but here it started to feel a little tired, and it was jarring tonally with everything else because it felt like it took away from the rest of the story. So I didn't dislike the book completely. I still had fun. Unfortunately, I have kind of set myself up as a reader to view the last book in a series almost as a kind of pinnacle, and the idea that that is a story that we are really waiting for in some ways. And we didn't really seed these characters and their stories significantly in the other two books. Instead, I found myself getting distracted and found references to Alex and Lauren's relationship in this book upstaging our main couple, which is unfortunate. Now, that was one of two books that I read in part in the backseat of the car on the way to my brother's wedding. The second being Harriet Tubman Live in Concert by Bob the Drag Queen, which we have talked about in a Feature Friday. This book is high concept in that we, as the reader, are following a music producer that has kind of seen the height of his career, and we learn more about that as well, as he is called in because this is a world in which historical figures have started to pop back up without any real explanation of that, which I absolutely love. It's just a given circumstance of the world. And with that, he has been called in to meet with Harriet Tubman, who wants to produce an album about her life. But of course, she also has her band, the Freemen. And one of the things I talked about most in my Feature Friday of this book is how intrigued I was by it dramaturgically, because as I was reading it, I couldn't help but imagine it up on its feet on the stage. And there was something very inherently theatrical to the concept of it, to the way the writing was kind of framed as well. It is a lot of monologue and kind of information through dialogue and monologue, and not in a way that feels info dumpy, because the voice and the tone of it is so unique and strong, and the concept is so strong. But I had been kind of speculating in a way I haven't recently in terms of like, what form do you choose to tell a story? And I didn't do a whole lot of research into the book prior to that review because I wanted my reactions to be my own and kind of not shaped by any outside sources, which is not always the case. Sometimes I do want to refine those thoughts a little bit, but I had such a kernel going there that I really wanted to play with. And then I ran into some of my best friends from college a week or so after talking about that book, and we were all theater students together, and Tyler and Olivia in particular, it was Olivia's birthday, happy belated birthday Olivia, were the two former roommates that I've watched any of the RuPaul's Drag Race I've watched with, and I am fairly certain we watched part of Bob the Drag Queen's season together. But time is a liminal space, as this book is kind of set in a liminal space. And Tyler was talking about having read the book and how it was originally conceived of as a play, which kind of made everything click in my brain. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a whole other conversation about why an author or a creative would be turned to a novel first versus a play, and the kind of quagmire of new play development as a dramaturg who has been intimately involved in new play development at one point in my career, not recently. However, I do want to emphasize as well that I think the book works as a book, and that was part of the consideration as well. Like, there are all of these parts of the book that feel very theatrical and feel interesting in their form in a way that I would love to see on the stage and am very thirsty for in my scripts from a theatrical perspective. But at the same time, I felt like the book offered the medium something within the reading experience of a book that stood on its own as well, in terms of the perspective of our narrator in particular. The structure, while it lends itself very well to the stage, worked very well as a novel. And also, I talked about this idea of the concert at the end and just the music in any way as well. There are poems in the book that are the songs. However, we also have this ability for our imagination to fill in the gaps of the music, and also that final moment, whatever that looks like. And so I think that there is something powerful in that as well. And in the theater, on stage, we would have to navigate that much differently. We would have to have an answer to those moments in a different way. And it may still be leaving it up to the imagination to whatever extent, but there is more anticipation and building to that specific moment, where here we are building to that moment, but there is never the assumption that that moment is going to come to a musical kind of ending for us, and just kind of what's open to the imagination in what these songs sound like. So that was really interesting to consider after the fact as well. However, as a whole too, I just love the exploration of Harriet Tubman. As I mentioned in my Feature Friday, I read or exhausted all of the Harriet Tubman biographies I could get my hands on as a kid in, I think, both the school and the public libraries, and I haven't really revisited that as an adult, and I really feel like I should, to kind of appreciate the span of her life even more. And it was interesting to see the way that we embody and engage with legacy. And I think the voice of this and the tone of this was an interesting exploration of legacy, Harriet Tubman's in particular. And then in my quest to be better about reading 2025 historical romance releases in a more timely fashion, which I have not been completely successful at this year, I had my library loan of My Inconvenient Duke by Loretta Chase expiring, so I prioritized that. Now, this is the third in the Difficult Duke series, and I had not read the prior two, and that was a mistake. This book does not stand on its own. I read some reviews from other readers on Goodreads that indicated that we see much more of these two being our couple, Alice and Giles, over the course of the other books in this series, which I am still intrigued by, though there was some critique from some reviewers even on the framing of what part of their story we were dropped in on, because it seemed like they were shown later in their relationship in the other two books, especially based on the timeline, because at the end of this book, the other two friends of Giles aren't married yet, and the other two books, to my understanding, are their books. So I assume this was the kind of slow burn anticipated relationship in the what happened between these two, which we've seen successfully in books like The Day of the Duchess, for instance. This was not successful for me, and to be fair, things like The Day of the Duchess, I had read the books prior to that book going in. But I, as a reader, was left really floundering in this book. It made me question my intelligence at points, because I had such a hard time grasping on to these characters and who they were and what the stakes of their lives even were, even with a potential outside antagonist that was really compelling and primed to be something that I absolutely ate up. And I was really intrigued at the start of this book by the concept of a wastrel versus a rogue, because Alice has decided that she needs to get married for her own protection, because her brother, while fooling around with his friends, has an accident with a gun going off, and everyone was ultimately fine, but it kind of scares her and shows her how precarious things are, and she feels like her brother is kind of at a point of no return, as well as his friends. It's also established that Giles, who is one of Alice's brother's friends, one of the wastrels, at one point was very much interested in Alice, and Alice's brother basically said, "Stop. You're not good enough. None of us are good enough for her. You are not who is going to be what's right for her," and basically set up the ultimatum of me or her. And Giles picked his friend. And so I was very interested in seeing the kind of reformation of a wastrel, which is much different, I would argue, than like a rake or a rogue, that has this element of competence to them, even if there is a front, in the way that that archetype has been kind of established in the genre, I would argue. And here we have someone who is potentially not as assured of himself or the world he's in, and in a lot of ways harder to redeem. And unfortunately, while that is such an interesting premise, and I was so compelled by that and excited to see that executed, it did not deliver. And additionally, the pacing of this book was just all over the place. So unfortunately, this was very much a miss for me, but I also did get the sense that Chase had kind of written herself into a corner in some ways. So I am still interested in the other two friends' books, and hopefully those will be a little more successful for me as a reader. And then next, I read one of my most anticipated books in the spring, also a win for me in reading my independent bookstore day books In a somewhat timely fashion, I read Don't Sleep with the Dead by Vo, which is the novella companion to The Chosen and the Beautiful, which is Vo's reimagining of The Great Gatsby from the perspective of Jordan Baker, and there is also some magic within that world and the way that world is framed. And if you have been with me for a couple of years, you know how much I love that book. To my recollection, The Chosen and the Beautiful is my favorite Vo. Now, her release from last year is giving it a run for its money, but I still have that in my mind as my favorite. This will be potentially tested because my book club has decided for next month we are reading The Chosen and the Beautiful, and I have already warned all of them because one of my best friends is a big fan of The Great Gatsby, and she raised some concerns in the group chat about R.F. Kuang's blurb on The Chosen and the Beautiful about how this is the way The Great Gatsby should be told, and I said it's marketing, and also if everyone but me hates this book, I'm going to go drink margaritas in the corner by myself at book club because I will still show up because I want margaritas, but I will just go enjoy them alone. Anyway, Don't Sleep with the Dead is revisiting the world of The Chosen and the Beautiful years later, during the Depression, on the cusp of World War II, but this time we are back in the perspective of Nick Carraway. And it very much takes place, wait for it, in a liminal space because we are on the kind of precipice of war and we are in the week in between Christmas and New Year's. Nick is in a very reflective mood. We do get the sense that the world of The Great Gatsby still exists here because Nick is established as an author with a famous book, and I think there are references like to the eyes that we see referenced still in The Chosen and the Beautiful and are very much a part of The Great Gatsby. But this is Nick kind of grappling with sense of self, especially in relation to some of the revelations we get at the end of The Chosen and the Beautiful about Nick, which are unique to that telling of the story. And I've seen this advertised as a standalone novella in the same world as The Chosen and the Beautiful, and I understand that in some respects because we are not in Jordan Baker's point of view. We're not continuing her story, but there is a significant revelation about Nick that directly plays into this novella and a lot of the considerations in this novella and the way that Nick is grappling with his identity in this novella. And in that, he is looking back and reminiscing on Gatsby and feeling haunted by Gatsby in some ways. I will say Gatsby is in less active physical presence than I anticipated going into this. I somewhat anticipated, probably hoped would be a better word, that this was reuniting the two of them to kind of hash out some of the things of the past and look to the future. Now, one thing that does stay in this book is the kind of world, and it's an interesting kind of parallel and juxtaposition because Gatsby is haunted by the past and living in the past. And so are we, in some respects, seeing Nick repeat that, especially with a setting later in the book that is firmly rooted in the past. And so there are layers of metaphor here. The language is gorgeous and lyrical, as Vo's language is always gorgeous and lyrical. We keep that element of magic that permeates throughout. An element is, I think, kind of underselling it in relation, but it also isn't overshadowing and upstaging everything else going on in the book, which I really appreciate about Vo's work. I love the just kind of accepted magical undercurrents of everything, and we see some callbacks to the way that magic worked within the world of The Chosen and the Beautiful and the Roaring Twenties, and how that magic has changed in light of the Depression and the kind of desperation of everyone, and that desperation is mirrored in some ways in Nick and in his state of mind. So there is a lot going on in this book, and as usual we have this kind of sense of everything being just a little haunted, which was also reflected in my reading experience of this book because it's only 100 pages, so it's basically a one-sit read. Which, do we need to be paying 25, as I said on Indie Bookstore Day, human dollars for a 100-page book? I would argue no, but I did buy it, so I guess I could also argue yes. Anyway, I sat down and I had started it and I had my window cracked. And as I said, this book is kind of haunted by the ghosts of the past. Even if they're not tangible, we see them or feel them kind of on the periphery of everything. And there's a lot at play in relation to the periphery here and what Nick is kind of sensing just out of sight line, even if it's not explicitly articulated that way. Anyway, I start hearing these kind of murmurings coming in on the breeze, and I was like, oh, this is atmospheric. What a perfect way to kind of set the mood of this book. And then I actually listened just a little closer, and it was Go Cubs Go wafting in with the breeze, but you know, it was still setting the mood. And then next, luckily, because I feel like I've been a little harsh on the romances I've read so far last month, I read my first Alexandra Vasti Earl Crush, which I was absolutely delighted by. I put up a short review of this book as well, but this follows Lydia, who writes anonymous political pamphlets, and through this, she has been corresponding with a Scottish Earl for a couple of years and really feels connected to this man, feels like they agree on so many things politically, and because of this, she gets it in her head that this is the perfect candidate for a marriage of convenience, because he will offer her, as a Shire person, this kind of comfort and familiarity, and she has a large dowry that she brings to the table, and she knows that his estate needs this money based on their correspondence. And so we start the book with Lydia wrangling her best friend and going to Scotland to show up literally on this man's doorstep. Except when she does, she discovers she has not actually been corresponding with the real Earl, but in fact his younger brother. And not only that, but the younger brother has absconded with some of the intellectual property relating to a weapon of the real Earl and may be working with the enemy, essentially, or have completely different political leanings than he has framed himself as having to Lydia, and so stands in direct opposition to all she cares for. And so while her instinctual instinct is probably understandably to get the heck out of Dodge as quickly as possible, she is thwarted by, at the very least, a zebra stampede, and eventually is convinced to help Arthur, the Earl, kind of track down his brother through using her letters and their correspondence to kind of get a feel for where he may be. And through this madcap adventure and pretending to be married for the plot and for the spying for a brief period, Lydia and Arthur grow closer. And they are both absolutely delightful, and I'm not just appreciating Arthur for only his thighs again this time, but as I mentioned in my short review, I am really drawn to characters who want so badly, so earnestly, but also are afraid to name the thing they want. We'll leave whatever that may say about me aside, but notably with this, often when this is the case, characters are willing to sacrifice what they want for their love interest. And often what they believe their love interest wants is not actually the case. And so this happens here, but at the same time, while this may kind of put up red flags of miscommunication, I do think that these two attempt to communicate so well, and they do talk things out. They don't always get it right, but we do come back to these moments that really push them together and force them to tell the other what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And there is a comfort that develops there that is really beautiful, especially when paralleled with the comfort that Lydia was seeking and which she thought she had with Arthur's brother. Additionally, I really loved the way the brother was handled in this and some of the reveals and reversals of the espionage plot lines that were also all kind of underscored by a really delightful humor that didn't veer too far into parody for me, but really struck a nice balance in terms of allowing that emotional depth and vulnerability while kind of balancing it with that levity. It's interesting because I absolutely loved Arthur, and I was talking to one of my mutuals who has read the first book, and she said that her enjoyment of this book was somewhat impeded. She said she loved it, but it was impeded by the fact that she loved the hero in the first book more than Arthur. And so that is intriguing. Like, what delights do I have in store from the first book, especially considering how much I really did love Arthur. Did he always get it right? No, but I still really appreciated it. And also that it really did tap into a lot of his insecurities as well, and how those insecurities, or the insecurities from both of our characters, framed their worldview that made the misunderstandings, or any misunderstandings or miscommunication that happened. We as readers, I felt, understood where that was coming from. And I would argue that oftentimes with miscommunication, it's not about the miscommunication as much, because none of us are perfect communicators, and that is part of the biggest impetus of conflict in something that is more personal and character driven like romance. But in fact, the use of miscommunication that isn't grounded or rooted in the characters, or that doesn't make sense in order to forward a plot convenience. And here it didn't feel contrived or like a plot convenience. It felt very rooted in these characters, who I absolutely loved. So I'm very excited to go back to the first book and find out if I love those characters even more. And also, I think we are getting the third book already this year, so that is exciting. Also, I noticed last night while browsing through Kindle Unlimited that I think this is already up on KU now. So absolutely, if you have a KU subscription, add this to your list. Okay, the next two books I did do Feature Fridays on, so I will try to keep it succinct. But the first is Audition by Katie Kitamura, which I need to get back to the library, which is part of the reason we are sitting down now. Though again, the internet is a liminal space and the now means nothing to you. However, this is a novel that is told from the perspective of an actress who is currently working on opening a new show. And at the beginning of the novel, we see her contemplating not even going to this luncheon that she is waiting outside the restaurant for, as she's kind of looking in, observing. And she is meeting this young man that she does not know, to our perception. And the first half of the novel, in its kind of stream of consciousness-esque style, really establishes what the reality is, what this woman's relationship is to this other person at the luncheon, and also how that factors in to her other relationships, including her relationship with her husband. And then in the second half of the book, we kind of turn that on its head and introduce a new reality. Now, the blurb of the book describes this as a Mobius strip, which implies a kind of turning in on itself. Well, in the book, there is this metaphor of an extended scene within the play that is kind of conjoining two really disparate parts of this storytelling of the play within this book, and how they're being kind of jammed together within the course, or over the course of this scene, and how the scene isn't working because these parts don't work together. And that kind of takes us in to the second half of the book in a way that's almost kind of like a hinge in some ways. And so there is more distinction, I would argue. At the same time, there is this porous nature, especially to the storytelling, which I understand in the kind of slinking in and on itself in relation to the comparison to the Mobius strip. And a lot of the book is interested in asking us as the reader questions, and making us question our sense of reality, and also kind of interrogating how we present and are perceived in relation to our roles in society, and especially as we age as women. And so there are a lot of considerations there. However, what the book doesn't have is a lot of answers. And as I have been seeing more content about the book and reviews of the book after having finished it, I'm seeing that become a real stumbling block for a lot of readers, this lack of answer and kind of catharsis of answer at the end of the book. Now, the lack of real resolution and answers in and of itself doesn't bother me, because I think that that is what the book is interested in interrogating. However, I don't know that the book itself is ultimately successful in what it's exploring, because I think the ideas get kind of convoluted, and I think so much hinges on that kind of reversal for the reader of the expectations of the reality we thought we were establishing within this narrative, within a voice and tone that already asks a lot of the reader in terms of kind of enveloping us in the language. And I think that it makes sense that a lot of readers are going to be kind of butting up against this lack of certainty in both the writing style and within the plotting itself. And I am always open to questions being asked within fiction, and I am very much a fan of inventive structure and narrative storytelling that kind of subverts expectations, but I also recognize how fragile that is, and you have to be so careful. And even when it doesn't always get it right, there are books that I've loved that take big risks in its storytelling, and I don't know that they always stick the landing in those risks, but I really appreciate what we're doing narratively enough to get over that hurdle. At this point, though, I don't know that this book is offering me enough to make me kind of overlook a lot of the hurdles of the storytelling, and the hurdles are the point. I recognize that, but at the same time, I feel like I almost need like additional materials, conversations, the author to kind of come in and tell me what exactly they were interrogating, exploring, and doing with the book and with the way it was constructed. And I don't know if I want to have to engage on that level with this particular work. Next, I finally finished Oathbound by Tracy Deonn, which is the third in the Legendborn cycle, and absolutely lived up to my anticipation of this book, even using some narrative choices that aren't exactly my favorite in terms of plotting, but all make sense within the kind of construct of this novel. And I'm not going to spoil anything because I think everyone should be reading the Legendborn cycle, so I don't want to steal that joy of discovery for you if you are coming into this series as a new reader. I will say that this is kind of the quest book in some ways within the context of Arthurian legend and framing this series within Arthurian legend, while this book also moves us the furthest we've been from Arthurian legend within the course of the series, which also makes sense within the plotting. So I am so excited to see where Deonn ultimately takes us on this journey. I think we have established such a strong ensemble, and while I love Bree with my absolute whole heart, I was also tickled to get to see more from the ensemble's perspectives in this book, and also to be able to see Bree from more of the perspectives of her friends and those around her. So absolutely a delight, a lot to dig into. I talk about it a little bit more in depth in my Feature Friday, but at the same time, I don't feel like there are ever enough words to like fully, this is the kind of series where you can do deep dives on specific characters, on specific relationships, on specific thematic elements. And while I have not taken that on myself, at this point, I absolutely think every conversation around this series is valid and really speaks to the intention that Deonn has placed in crafting this world. Next, I read a cozier romantasy, Wooing the Witch by Stephanie Burgess. This follows an archduke who is kind of more symbolic. And he is a widower at the start of the book. He had married his childhood best friend and she has passed away. And he has been, over the course of his life, really kind of used by his advisors, who are family members of his former wife, who he loved dearly, but these family members do not have the same care for him and really view him as a way to gain power. And so at the start of this book, while kind of presenting as more of a carefree, kind of not a wastrel, but somewhat kind of wastrel-esque, he is kind of feeling the idea that maybe his advisors, his in-laws, may be looking to get rid of him and grasp the power fully for themselves and no longer use him as this figurehead. And so he has decided to flee and seek refuge and sanctuary with this witch queen, Saskia, who has regained the throne after her uncle had killed her parents as a child, in using her as this kind of boogeyman of sorts and her magic, and really instilling fear in the people. There are a lot of parallels to current political moments within this cozier fantasy that gives us a safer, quieter kind of exploration of that. And so our Archduke Felix shows up and seeks an audience with Saskia, and there is immediately a misunderstanding in that she assumes that he is a man coming to fill her advert for a dark wizard. At the same time, Felix gets the sense that he in his real identity will not actually be granted sanctuary in this place and will not be as safe as he thought. And so he plays in to this idea of being here in order to fill this vacancy of a dark wizard needed at this castle. And Saskia needs a dark wizard to work in her library and to sort out her library. And Felix is like, you know what? Actually, I think I can do that, because he studied poetry in school and these things that his advisors considered more frivolous, and so he would be as removed from the politics as possible. But this gives him the ability to kind of sort through these magical texts, and this is very satisfying to him. He really enjoys this work, and he also thinks that this will give him the opportunity to understand magic a little bit more in order to not only keep his cover story going, but also maybe give him some out and ability to see a future kind of escaped of all of this. In the meantime, Saskia is kind of going through the motions of politics in her kingdom, even though she would much rather be in her laboratory messing with potions. But her ex-girlfriend is one of her main advisors and is encouraging her to take a more public-facing kind of role and to enter international politics in a bigger way and to pay attention to international politics and some of the dangers internationally in a bigger way. At the same time, she has formed a kind of alliance with two other maligned, powerful rulers, powerful women within this larger fantastical world, who I am sure we will find out much more about in subsequent books. And in this, she is basically given the kernel of an idea that the Archduke Felix is a danger to the peace that she has built in her country and the refuge for magical creatures that she has built in her country, and she has to find this man. And she goes to her librarian, the Dark Wizard, in order to see what he may know about location spells. And irregardless of the fact that he knows no location spells, a fact he cannot admit to, he also very much has a vested interest in not finding the Archduke Felix. Additionally, amidst all of this, Felix, or Fabian, as he comes to be known in this castle, has really started holding himself away in the library, and the others in the castle, like the head of the kitchen and the head housekeeper and butler-esque person, are very much against this and really kind of pull him into the family of this world. Meanwhile, he is attracted to Saskia from the minute he sees her, essentially, and is kind of trying to play it cool, but it's also very clear that he is attracted to her power and her attitude, so he is a little bit more subservient in some ways in relationships that are developing. Meanwhile, she starts to become more attracted to him as well, but feels like that is a conflict and that she shouldn't be, so they're both kind of trying to shy away from these feelings even as they are growing closer and spending more time together. Meanwhile, Fabian has made friends with the crows in the castle as well. And while on Instagram I did kind of compare this to an adult Gail Carson Levine in some ways, and not just because of the ogres, but also those mistaken identities, those kind of rules of the magic and what these characters can and can't reveal to each other about that, feels very of that vein, especially the kind of Ella Enchanted vein for sure. There are also elements of historical romance in the politicking a little bit, yes, but also in things like a sexy cravat removal, which I am always here for. And we additionally have a hero with some more political standing that is more subservient and quieter in some ways in intimate relationships, in a way that I haven't really seen since Eva Leigh's Would I Lie to the Duke, which was very satisfying. So maybe I need to be on the hunt for more of that, because I was very much interested in the dynamics romantically in this book. I will admit, pacing-wise, it felt a little slow to me in the beginning. I think I had to kind of acclimate to the cozier world and the way that stakes present within that world, and just kind of suspend my disbelief on some of the ways things were being hidden and just the dynamics of the world. But once I really settled into the world, I absolutely had a blast. And that's really saying something too, because mistaken identity in my romance isn't a go-to trope for me. It's actually more of a kind of hurdle for me narratively. So I was really delighted that this worked so well for me. Then after an entire month of listening to no audiobooks and not being able to focus on audiobooks, I slipped in 2 audiobooks at the end of the month. I got that end of the month focus, I guess, but I listened to How to Be Well, Navigating Our Self-Care Epidemic One Dubious Cure at a Time by Amy LaRocca, which I was very intrigued by in thinking of this book or seeing this book as a kind of exploration and takedown of modern wellness culture, which it was. It definitely did interrogate kind of some of the more like snake oil salesman side of the industry. It did reference some of the multi-level marketing schemes that really have been central to a lot of the industry, the unregulated claims, things of that nature. It also acknowledges wellness and modern wellness culture as a kind of class indicator and the ways that that functions within society, and especially presentation for women and expectations for women. So there was a lot here I really enjoyed, and at the same time I wanted it to push even further. I think I wanted it to be more of a takedown. I got the sense, and from the very beginning, the author really does acknowledge that she has tried some of these things. She has been caught up at times in the wellness wheel, even as she is critiquing them. And I do think the impetus of the critique could have been explored a little further. I think I wouldn't have minded seeing the author insert herself a little bit more in that, and she did already. She really did frame a lot of this through her own experience with the industry, especially as someone who has come in contact with it as a former magazine writer at a magazine who really did brush against a lot of this, which I found a very interesting perspective. But as someone who has been skeptical of the wellness industry, even as I find myself getting kind of caught up in the marketing sometimes or pulled in and having to kind of check where that's coming from, I did get the sense that the author really wanted a lot of this to be true. So ultimately, I don't know if it was as much of a deep dive takedown of wellness culture as I hoped. I think the angles at which she came at the exploration were interesting, but at the same time, I really would have liked to see it push a little further into that interrogation and critique and analysis of the system. And then finally, because I was in a contemporary romance mood, and I really do well with contemporary romance on audio, I devoured in practically a day Not Safe for Work by Nisha J. Tooley, which is a contemporary romance following a woman who is an engineer and has kind of had to reshift and refocus her career following a scandal early in her career where she was kind of taken advantage of as a young employee. And at her current position, she has this kind of rivalry with Rafe, the boss's son, and a man who got a promotion over her primarily based on being the boss's son, and also how she has systematically been passed over for promotions and opportunities time and time again, which is why she was shocked to be selected to be sent to a conference in Hawaii that is developing talent at the company and working on building leadership. And when she goes to the head of the company, it is basically made clear to her that she is being sent to fill a diversity quota. And she decides to leverage that admission to negotiate a suite for the week, only to show up and realize that only one suite has been booked for the people being sent from said company to the conference. And so they are forced to share a suite, Rafe on the pullout couch, as they are also attending these conferences and bickering, and Rafe is taking calls from his ex-girlfriend, and their dynamic slowly starts to shift over the course of the week, even as both of their motivations within the workplace become a little more clear. Now, are some of their arguments and bickering, especially within public places, around other people from other companies and in these conference settings, sometimes really cringy and give me a lot of secondhand embarrassment? Absolutely. Did I also eat up every single moment of this book? Yes. And eat up is also an apt word because no big spoilers intended, but this is the second book I've read now this year where the hero gets a lot of, shall we say, satisfaction from watching his love interest enjoy a good suite. The other being a tropical rebel gets the Duke. So if that is something you are looking for, there are two recommendations for you. I couldn't help as I was reading this thinking that this was kind of a modern, nicer version of The Hating Game, which I loved in 2016. And when I reread it a couple of years ago for Romance Book Club as a kind of first introduction for a lot of the readers in my book club to contemporary romance, and me kind of considering it one of the pinnacles of contemporary romance at the time, when I revisited it, it was a lot meaner than I remembered. And not just our leads to each other, but the way especially Lucy talked about her boss, who was awful, but also mentioning his body in that more than his behavior. And it just felt mean sometimes. Now, granted, I had also read her other book, or at the time, her other book after that, and really disliked it. And so that did kind of reframe some of my perspective on the hating game as well. And while I say meaner, I did still really enjoy the book, but this felt like a nicer but still very much charged version of the hating game in terms of that workplace rivalry and the sexual tension kind of balled up with that. And they can absolutely be mean to each other, but we do revisit that, reframe that, and they aren't necessarily being mean to the people around them that do not deserve it. We also get to see Rafe be very protective of Triss, even when in theory he does not like her. And there are also some moments that again parallel what some readers may enjoy from the hating game in terms of some of our reveals and reframing of these characters and their relationship and their perceptions of how the other actually views them. Anyway, if you are looking for a fun, steamy workplace romance, it is kind of a slow burn just to set proper expectations there, but absolutely pick this one up. And with that, that is what I read in May. So if you've read any of these, I would love to hear your thoughts on them. I would love to hear what you read in May, what you liked, what you loved, what maybe didn't work so much for you. But as always, thank you for being here and being interested in what I read and my thoughts on what I read. But like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.